The humid tropical air hung heavy over Manila Bay as dawn broke on May 1st, 1898. Commodore George Dewey stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Olympia, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the Spanish fleet anchored in the distance. The morning mist clung to the water like a shroud, but through it, he could make out the silhouettes of Admiral Patricio Montoyo's vessels, 10 ships in total, their Spanish flags hanging limp in the still air. Mind raced back to the events that had brought him to this moment. Just 2 months earlier, the USS Maine had exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors and igniting the flames of war between the United States and Spain. The cry of "Remember the Maine" had echoed through the halls of Congress, and President William McKinley had reluctantly declared war on April the 25th. Within days, Dewey had received his orders from Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt. Proceed to the Philippines and destroy the Spanish Pacific Fleet. The journey from Hong Kong had been treacherous. Warships comprising the protected cruisers Olympia, Baltimore, Raleigh, and Boston, the gunboat Petrel, and the revenue cutter McCulloch had steamed through uncertain waters. Intelligence reports suggested that the Spanish had laid mines throughout Manila Bay, turning the harbor into a potential death trap for any approaching fleet, as referenced in contemporary accounts from the New York Herald's coverage of the Philippine campaign. Tensions had been mounting in the Pacific for months before the actual declaration of war. The Spanish colonial administration in Manila, led by Governor-General Basilio Agustin, had been preparing defensive positions while simultaneously dealing with ongoing Filipino revolutionary forces under Emilio Aguinaldo. Dewey's officers gathered around him as the morning light strengthened. Captain Charles Gridley, of the Olympia, a veteran of the Civil War, stood silent and determined. The Commodore had chosen to enter the bay under cover of darkness, successfully navigating past the potentially mined entrance at Boca Grande despite the risks. The gamble had paid off. No explosions had torn through his ship's hulls, and now they found themselves in position to engage the enemy. The Spanish fleet, commanded by Admiral Montoyo, presented a mixed picture of naval power. His flagship, the Reina Cristina, was a respectable cruiser, but many of his vessels were aging and undermanned. The wooden gunboats and antiquated cruisers bore the scars of years of colonial service in the tropical climate. Montoyo had positioned his fleet near the Cavite Naval Station, hoping to use the shore batteries for additional support. Dewey surveyed his own forces with quiet confidence. The Olympia, his flagship, was a modern protected cruiser armed with 4 8-inch guns and 10 5-inch rapid-fire weapons. The Baltimore and Boston were similarly equipped sister ships, while the Raleigh, though smaller, carried a potent armament. These vessels represented the new American Navy that had been built in the preceding decades. Steel-hulled, modern warships that could match any fleet in the world. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, both fleets prepared for battle. Spanish sailors could be seen moving frantically across their decks, preparing guns and ammunition. On the American ships, crews stood at their battle stations, the tension palpable as they awaited orders. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific and announce America's arrival as a global naval force. The die was cast, and history waited to unfold in the waters of Manila Bay. At 5:53 in the morning, as the golden Philippine sun climbed above the horizon, Commodore Dewey gave the order that would echo through naval history. Standing calmly on the bridge of the USS Olympia, he turned to his flag captain and spoke the words that would become legend. "You may fire when ready, Gridley." The Battle of Manila Bay had begun. Captain Charles Gridley immediately relayed the command, and the Olympia's forward 8-inch guns roared to life. The thunderous boom rolled across the calm waters as the first American shells arced through the morning air toward the Spanish fleet. Within moments, the entire American line had opened fire, creating a devastating barrage that shattered the tropical peace of Manila Bay. The Spanish response was swift but uncoordinated. Admiral Montoyo's flagship, the Reina Cristina, returned fire with her antiquated guns, followed by the rest of his fleet. However, The range was extreme, over 5,000 yards, and the Spanish gunners, many of whom were inexperienced Filipino conscripts, struggled to find their targets. Their shells splashed harmlessly into the bay or whistled high over the American ships. Dewey had orchestrated his attack with tactical brilliance, leading his squadron in a single column, with the Olympia at the head, followed by the Baltimore, Raleigh, Petrel, Concord, and Boston. He steamed parallel to the Spanish line. This formation allowed all his ships to bring their broadsides to bear, while presenting a narrow target to the enemy. The American vessels maintained a steady speed of 8 knots. Their modern fire control systems, enabling accurate shooting. Even while maneuvering, the contrast between the two fleets became apparent within the first hour of battle. The American ships, with their trained crews and superior equipment, maintained a steady and accurate fire. The Spanish vessels, hampered by poor maintenance, outdated weapons, and inadequate training, found themselves increasingly outmatched. The shore batteries at Cavite Arsenal joined the fight, but their guns were too few and too poorly positioned to significantly affect the outcome, as documented in reports from war correspondents who later interviewed participants, including those published in Harper's Weekly. The American sailors displayed remarkable discipline under fire. Despite the Spanish shells falling around them, the gun crews maintained their positions and continued their methodical bombardment. The superior training of the American Navy, implemented during the modernization programs of the 1880s and 90s, showed its value in this crucial moment by 7:35 in the morning. After nearly 2 hours of continuous fighting, an unexpected lull occurred. Reports reached Dewey that the Olympia's ammunition was running dangerously low. The Commodore ordered his fleet to withdraw to a safe distance to assess the situation and redistribute ammunition. This pause in the battle created one of the war's most dramatic moments. As both sides used the respite to evaluate their positions, the Spanish fleet had suffered severe damage during the initial engagement. The Reina Cristina, Admiral Montoyo's flagship, had been holed multiple times and was taking on water. Several of her guns had been knocked out, and casualties were mounting among her crew. The wooden gunboat Don Juan de Austria had been set ablaze by American shells, her crew fighting desperately to control the spreading fires. Other Spanish vessels showed similar signs of distress, with damaged superstructures and smoking funnels. Bearing witness to the accuracy of American gunnery, during the ammunition check, American officers were surprised to discover that their supply situation was far better than initially reported. A miscommunication had led to the erroneous low ammunition report. The ships had expended less than 1/8 of their total ammunition supply and were more than capable of continuing the engagement. This discovery would prove crucial for the battle's final phase. The Spanish, meanwhile, used the lull to attempt repairs and reorganize their battered formation. Admiral Montoyo realized his position was becoming untenable, but Spanish naval honor demanded that he continue the fight. His ships remained at their stations, their crews preparing for the resumption of hostilities with grim determination. As the morning progressed, toward noon, both fleets prepared for the decisive phase of the engagement. Unaware that the outcome would reshape the entire geopolitical landscape of the Pacific, at 11:16 in the morning, Commodore Dewey signaled his fleet to resume the attack. The American squadron steamed back toward the Spanish line with renewed determination. Having discovered that their ammunition supplies were more than adequate to complete their mission, the brief respite had allowed both sides to assess their situations. But the advantage clearly lay with the Americans. The second phase of the battle proved even more devastating than the first. The USS Baltimore, under Captain Nehemiah Dyer, positioned herself for a particularly effective attack run. Her 8-inch guns found their range quickly, sending shell after shell into the Spanish vessels with deadly accuracy. The protected cruiser's modern fire control systems, combined with the extensive gunnery training her crew had received, made her shooting remarkably precise at ranges that would have been impossible for older naval vessels. Admiral Montoyo, recognizing the desperate nature of his situation, made a courageous but ultimately futile decision. He ordered the Reina Cristina to make a bold charge toward the American line, hoping to close the range and bring his lighter weapons into effective play. The Spanish flagship steamed directly toward the USS Olympia, her battle ensign flying proudly, despite the damage she had already sustained. The Reina Cristina's charge became one of the most heroic episodes of the battle, with her hull already pierced by multiple shells and water flooding her lower compartments. She pressed forward through the concentrated fire of the entire American squadron. Her crew, displaying remarkable courage under impossible circumstances, continued to serve their guns even as American shells crashed through her superstructure. But the brave attempt was doomed from the start. As reported in contemporary accounts preserved in the Spanish naval archives, which were later referenced by American military historians, the Reina Cristina suffered catastrophic damage during her charge. Multiple 8-inch shells from the Olympia and Baltimore struck her amidships, destroying her engine room and killing many of her crew. With her machinery disabled and fires spreading throughout the ship, Admiral Montoya was forced to abandon his flagship and transfer to the smaller gunboat, La de Cuba. The sight of the Spanish flagship's destruction had a profound effect on the morale of both fleets. American sailors cheered as the Reina Cristina limped back toward shallow water, her proud silhouette now broken and smoking. The Spanish crews, witnessing their admiral's plight, began to realize the hopelessness of their situation, yet continued to fight with admirable determination. The USS Petrel, the smallest of Dewey's warships, played a crucial role during this phase of the battle. Commander Edward Wood skillfully maneuvered his gunboat to engage the Spanish vessels at closer range, where his lighter weapons could be most effective. The Petrel's rapid-fire guns proved devastating against the wooden hulls of several Spanish gunboats, setting fires that would ultimately consume them entirely. Meanwhile, the USS Raleigh, under Captain Joseph Coghlan, focused her attention on the Spanish shore installations. Her accurate gunnery systematically destroyed the coastal batteries that had been supporting the Spanish fleet, eliminating any possibility of effective fire from the land-based guns. The destruction of these positions further isolated the Spanish naval forces and removed their last source of tactical support. By noon, the Spanish fleet was in complete disarray. The Don Juan de Austria was fully engulfed in flames and had to be abandoned by her crew. The Don Antonio de Ulloa was sinking. In shallow water, her hull shattered by repeated hits from American 8-inch guns. Other Spanish vessels were either severely damaged or completely out of action, their crews struggling merely to keep their ships afloat. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. Filipino revolutionary forces, who had been observing the engagement from positions around the bay, began to realize that Spanish colonial power was crumbling before their eyes. This realization would have profound implications for the future of the Philippine independence movement. As the afternoon approached, it became clear that the Battle of Manila Bay was nearing its decisive conclusion, with American victory virtually assured. By 12:30 in the afternoon, the Spanish resistance had effectively collapsed. Admiral Montoya, now commanding from the small gunboat Isla de Cuba after abandoning his destroyed flagship, surveyed the devastation that had befallen his fleet. The pride of the Spanish Pacific Squadron lay in ruins around Manila Bay, some vessels burning, others sinking, and the remainder too damaged to continue effective resistance. The USS Olympia maintained her position at the head of the American line, her guns continuing their methodical destruction of the remaining Spanish vessels. Commodore Dewey, observing the carnage through his binoculars, began to realize the magnitude of his victory. Not a single American sailor had been killed, and only a handful had been wounded by Spanish fire. The disparity in casualties would become one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire engagement. The Spanish gunboat Ulloa made a final, desperate attempt to ram the USS Petrel. But the American vessel's superior speed and maneuverability allowed her to avoid the attack. The Petrel's rapid-fire guns then delivered the coup de grace to the brave but doomed Spanish vessel, sending her to the bottom of the bay with her colors still flying. This act of defiance epitomized the courage displayed by the Spanish sailors throughout the engagement. Even in the face of certain defeat, Captain Gridley of the Olympia The man who had received Dewey's famous order to commence firing stood on his bridge surveying the destruction. The veteran naval officer had participated in the Civil War battles of New Orleans and Mobile Bay under Admiral David Farragut. But even he was struck by the completeness of this victory. The modern naval warfare he was witnessing represented a new era in military technology and tactics, as documented in official Spanish military records that were later made available to American historians. The casualties aboard the Spanish vessels were staggering. The Reina Cristina alone had lost over 150 men killed and wounded during her heroic but futile charge against the American line. The total Spanish casualties would eventually reach over 380 men. While the Americans had suffered only 8 wounded sailors and not a single death, the shore installations at Cavite Arsenal were now completely silenced. The USS Baltimore and USS Boston had systematically destroyed every gun emplacement that could threaten American operations in the bay. The Spanish colonial administration's last means of military resistance in the Philippines had been eliminated. In a single morning's work by the United States Navy, at 1:15 in the afternoon, the last effective Spanish resistance came to an end. The transport Mindanao, which had been attempting to escape to shallow water, was overtaken by the USS Concord and forced to surrender. Her captain, realizing the futility of further resistance, struck his colors and signaled his willingness to capitulate. The symbolic act marked the effective end of Spanish naval power in the Pacific. Dewey now faced the practical challenges of victory. His small squadron controlled Manila Bay, but the city of Manila itself, with its Spanish garrison of over 13,000 troops, remained in enemy hands. The Commodore would need to balance his immediate tactical success with the longer-term strategic implications of his position. He had effectively severed the Philippines from Spanish control, but governing this vast archipelago would require sources far beyond what his naval squadron could provide. The news of the battle's outcome would take weeks to reach the outside world, but when it did, the impact would be profound. The United States had announced its arrival as a global naval power in the most dramatic fashion possible. European observers who had been skeptical of American military capabilities would be forced to reassess their assumptions about the emerging transatlantic republic. The Battle of Manila Bay was not merely a naval engagement. It was the opening act of America's transformation into a world power and the beginning of the end. For the centuries-old Spanish Empire, as the smoke cleared over Manila Bay in the early afternoon hours of May 1st, 1898, the full magnitude of what had transpired began to sink in for both victors and vanquished. Commodore George Dewey stood on the bridge of the USS Olympia, surveying a scene of complete and utter devastation that had been accomplished in less than 7 hours of actual combat. The Spanish fleet, which that morning had represented 4 centuries of Iberian naval tradition in the Pacific, was now little more than twisted metal and burning hulks scattered across the bay's calm waters. Of Admiral Montoyo's 10 vessels, not one remained capable of offering any meaningful resistance to American naval power. The Reina Cristina lay beached and burning near Cavite, her proud silhouette now a broken monument to the courage of her crew. The Don Juan de Austria had been completely consumed by fire, her magazine exploding in the early afternoon with a thunderous roar that was heard throughout Manila. The human cost of the battle fell almost entirely on the Spanish side. Final casualty reports, as later compiled by both Spanish and American authorities, revealed the stark disparity between the two forces. The Spanish had lost over 380 officers and men killed and wounded, with many more missing and presumed dead in the sunken vessels. Among the Spanish dead was Captain Luis Cadarso of the Reina Cristina, who had been killed early in the battle while directing his ship's desperate charge against the American line. In contrast, American casualties were almost negligible. Only 8 American sailors had been wounded during the entire engagement, and remarkably, not a single American life had been lost. This extraordinary disparity in casualties would become one of the most discussed aspects of the battle, highlighting the technological and tactical advantages that modern naval warfare had provided to the better prepared force, as referenced in comprehensive analyses published in the Journal of Military History decades later. The Battle of Manila Bay represented a watershed moment in naval warfare. The engagement demonstrated conclusively that superior technology, training, and tactics could achieve decisive victory with minimal losses when properly employed. The Spanish fleet's brave but futile resistance had been overcome by the inexorable logic of modern military science. The immediate practical consequences of the victory were enormous. American control of Manila Bay meant that Spanish reinforcements and supplies could no longer reach the Philippines by sea. Governor-General Basilio Agustin found himself effectively cut off from Spain. With only the limited resources already present in the islands available for the defense of the colony, the psychological impact on both Spanish colonial authorities and Filipino independence fighters was equally significant. Dewey faced immediate challenges in consolidating his victory. His squadron, while triumphant, was operating thousands of miles from the nearest American base. Ammunition, coal, and other essential supplies would need to be obtained locally or shipped from distant American ports. The Commodore established communications with American consular officials and began the complex process of arranging for the support his forces would need to maintain their position. The Filipino Revolutionary Forces, under Emilio Aguinaldo, watched these developments with keen interest. Aguinaldo, who had been exiled by the Spanish authorities, immediately began making overtures to the American forces. The Filipino leader saw in the American victory an opportunity to achieve the independence that his people had been fighting for against Spanish rule. However, the future relationship between American and Filipino forces would prove far more complex than either side initially anticipated. Within hours of the battle's conclusion, Dewey had dispatched the revenue cutter McCulloch to Hong Kong. With news of his victory, the message that would eventually reach Washington was simple but dramatic. The squadron, under my command, has destroyed the Spanish fleet. Only question now is complete control of Philippines. The speed and completeness of the victory had surprised even Dewey himself.
What many had expected to be a difficult and costly campaign had been resolved.
In a single morning's work, the implications of this success would extend far beyond the immediate military situation, reshaping America's role in world affairs and marking the emergence of the United States as a true global power. News of Commodore Dewey's stunning victory at Manila Bay did not reach the outside world immediately. The USS McCulloch, dispatched by Dewey to carry word of the triumph to Hong Kong, required several days to make the journey. When the news finally broke on May 7, 1898, it sent shockwaves through capitals across the globe and fundamentally altered international perceptions of American naval capabilities. In Washington, D.C., President William McKinley received the telegram reporting Dewey's victory with a mixture of elation and concern. The president, who had been reluctant to enter the war with Spain, now found himself confronting the reality of American territorial expansion in the Pacific. The complete destruction of the Spanish Pacific Fleet had created a power vacuum that the United States would somehow need to fill, regardless of whether that had been the original intention. The American press responded to the news with unbridled enthusiasm. Newspapers across the country proclaimed Dewey a national hero, with the New York World declaring him the Nelson of Manila Bay. The Commodore's calm demeanor and his famous order to fire when ready Gridley captured the public imagination, making him an instant celebrity. Street celebrations erupted in major American cities, with crowds gathering to sing patriotic songs and wave flags in honor of the naval victory. European reactions were more complex and revealing of the changing balance of world power. In London, British naval experts expressed surprise at the completeness of the American victory, with many having expected a more protracted engagement. The Royal Navy, the world's dominant naval force, began to reassess American capabilities with new respect. British strategic planners recognized that the United States had announced its arrival as a significant naval power in the most dramatic fashion possible. German Kaiser Wilhelm II's reaction was particularly telling. The German Empire had been expanding its own naval capabilities and harbored ambitions for Pacific territories. The swift American victory demonstrated that German plans for Pacific expansion might face more formidable opposition than previously anticipated. Within weeks of the battle, German warships appeared in Manila Bay under the pretext of protecting German commercial interests, leading to tense confrontations with American forces. As documented in contemporary diplomatic correspondence preserved in European Foreign Ministry archives, French and Russian officials also took careful note of the battle's implications. The traditional European balance of power, which had dominated international relations for centuries, was beginning to shift as new powers emerged on the global stage. The United States had demonstrated that it possessed both the capability and, apparently, the will to project power across vast oceanic distances in Spain itself. The news of the Manila Bay disaster was received with shock and disbelief. The Spanish public had been led to believe that their navy was capable of matching any potential opponent, and the complete destruction of the Pacific Fleet shattered these illusions. Prime Minister Praxedes Mateo Sagasta faced intense political pressure as the full extent of Spain's military weakness became apparent to the Spanish people. The battle's outcome also resonated throughout the colonial world, particularly in regions under European control. Native populations in various colonies began to question whether European military superiority was as absolute as they had been led to believe. The sight of a relatively young nation defeating an established European colonial power in such decisive fashion provided inspiration to independence movements worldwide. In the Philippines themselves, the reaction was complex and varied. Many Filipino intellectuals and revolutionaries saw the American victory as an opportunity to achieve independence from centuries of Spanish rule. Emilio Aguinaldo and other independence leaders initially welcomed the Americans as liberators, not yet understanding that the United States might have its own colonial ambitions for the archipelago. The international financial markets also responded dramatically to news of the battle. Spanish government bonds plummeted in European exchanges, while American securities strengthened. Investors recognized that the balance of global power was shifting, and they began repositioning their portfolios accordingly. The economic implications of American Pacific expansion were becoming apparent even before the political consequences had been fully worked out. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Manila Bay marked the beginning of what historians would later term the American century, the period of American global dominance that would define much of the 20th century and beyond. The Battle of Manila Bay concluded by early afternoon on May 1st, 1898, but its consequences would reverberate through history for generations to come. What had begun as a single naval engagement in a distant Pacific harbor had fundamentally altered the trajectory of world history, marking America's emergence as a global imperial power and hastening the collapse of the centuries-old Spanish Empire. Commodore George Dewey, the architect of this historic victory, would find his life transformed by the events of that morning. Congress promoted him to the rank of Admiral of the Navy, a rank created specifically for him and never held by another officer. His calm professionalism under fire and his strategic brilliance made him a national icon, with Dewey for President movements emerging across the country. Though he would never seek the presidency, his name became synonymous with American naval excellence and the nation's new global reach. The immediate military consequences of the battle were profound. Spanish resistance in the Philippines collapsed. Within months, as Governor-General Agustin found himself unable to maintain control without naval support or reinforcements from Spain. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, formally ceded the Philippines to the United States. Along with Guam and Puerto Rico, Spain received $20 million in compensation, but the age of Spanish colonial dominance was definitively ended, however. The American acquisition of the Philippines would prove more complex than anyone anticipated. The Filipino independence movement, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had initially welcomed American intervention as a means to achieve freedom from Spanish rule. When it became clear that the United States intended to establish its own colonial administration, the Philippine-American War erupted, lasting from 1899 to 1902, and resulting in hundreds of thousands of casualties. The technological lessons of Manila Bay were studied intensively by naval experts worldwide. The battle demonstrated the decisive advantage that modern steel warships, equipped with advanced gunnery systems and manned by professionally trained crews, could achieve over older vessels and less prepared opponents. Naval academies around the world revised their curricula to emphasize the importance of technological superiority and professional training that the American victory had so clearly illustrated, as documented in strategic analyses published by the U.S. Naval War College in the decades following the battle. Manila Bay marked a turning point in American strategic thinking. The victory demonstrated that the United States possessed the capability to project power across vast oceanic distances, fundamentally altering the nation's conception of its own role in world affairs. The isolationist foreign policy that had characterized much of the 19th century gave way to a new era of global engagement and imperial responsibility. The battle also had profound implications for the balance of power in East Asia. American acquisition of the Philippines provided the United States with a permanent foothold in the Western Pacific, from which it could influence events in China, Japan, and throughout the region. This geographic position would prove crucial during the two world wars of the 20th century and would establish the foundation for American Pacific strategy that continues to this day. The Spanish Empire, already weakened by internal struggles and economic difficulties, never recovered from the disasters of 1898. The loss of Cuba, the Philippines, and other territories marked the end of Spain's status as a major world power, reducing it to a secondary European nation. The psychological impact of these defeats would influence Spanish politics and society for decades to come. For the United States, the victory at Manila Bay represented both triumph and transformation. The nation that had been born from a colonial rebellion against European power had itself become a colonial power, acquiring overseas territories and assuming the responsibilities of empire. This transition was not without controversy, as American anti-imperialists argued that colonial expansion contradicted the nation's founding principles of self-determination and democratic governance. The men who fought in Manila Bay that morning could not have imagined the full consequences of their victory. They had answered their nation's call to arms and had performed their duties with extraordinary skill and courage. In doing so, they had helped to usher in a new era of world history, the American century that would see the United States rise from a regional power to the dominant force in global affairs. The Battle of Manila Bay stands as one of history's most decisive naval engagements, a 7-hour contest that changed the balance of world power and announced America's emergence as a global empire. The swift and complete victory achieved by Dewey's squadron demonstrated that the age of European colonial dominance was ending, and that new powers were rising to shape the destiny of nations across the globe.